The village of Tanfong lay nestled deep within a shadowy forest, where darkness lingered thick even in broad daylight. No one knew exactly how long the village had existed, only that its residents lived in isolation, rarely ventured out, and absolutely never welcomed strangers. The few who had accidentally stumbled upon this village described an atmosphere heavy with the scent of damp earth mixed with dried blood. The houses were crooked and dilapidated, barely standing, and in the center of the village stood a blackened wooden stilt house with a dried up well in front, a well from which sighs echoed at midnight. Ha! An anthropology student from a major university in the city stumbled upon Tan Fong in an ancient, dust covered manuscript hidden in the restricted section of her university's library. The trembling lines spoke of an ancestral spirit summoning ritual, a blood sacrifice ceremony that once took place in Tanfong. Ha was intrigued. She spent months researching and finally decided to travel alone to the village at the start of the rainy season that year. The last bus dropped her off on a dirt road about 5 kilometers from the village. From there, she had to walk through the forest. Each step sank into the mud, surrounded by rustling dry leaves and sudden flutters of birds that made her heart leap. The deeper she went, the colder it became, and the wind whispered as if someone were breathing into her ears. The sun vanished behind the dense canopy, leaving a heavy gray pall. Finally, just when she thought she was lost, the village appeared, a blurred ink stain beneath a foggy sky. The villagers did not welcome her. They only stared, silent, with eyes that looked long dead. A hunched old woman, bent like a dried branch, led Ha to the stilt house in the village center, where she was allowed to stay during her research. No one asked where she came from, and no one warned her of anything. They merely whispered among themselves in unintelligible murmurs as she passed by. That first night, Ha couldn't sleep. The wind moaned through the wooden slats, footsteps dragged outside on the wet earth, and mingled with them were the giggles of unseen children and the soft sobbing of a woman. Ha clutched her notebook tightly and shut her eyes, trying to believe it was all fatigue-induced hallucination. The next day, she began her survey. She took notes, photos, asked questions, but only received nods or headshakes in return. Only one person agreed to speak with her, Mr. Lamb, the well keeper, who also guarded the stilt house. He had deep-set eyes, upright white hair, and a voice as raspy as a funeral trumpet. He told her that the well was not dry. It was bottomless, reaching all the way to the underworld where the ancestors resided. On the night of the 7th lunar month's full moon, the villagers gathered around the well, cutting their flesh to drop blood into it for protection. If the ritual wasn't performed properly, it would rise. When Ha asked what it was, he merely laughed, revealing blackened teeth like charred wood, and turned away. The full moon came quickly. Rain poured, and the air reeked of iron-rich mud. Ha woke in the middle of the night to the sound of low drums echoing from the village center. Through a crack in the wall, she saw the villagers gathered around the well, each holding candles, chanting in a foreign tongue. A child, bound hand and foot, was brought forward, the same girl Ha had seen playing alone under the old banyan tree. The child screamed, but her cries were drowned by the rising chants. A white-haired woman stepped forward with a long knife, slicing the girl's forehead. Blood ran down, dripping into the dark mouth of the well. Then, the entire village knelt simultaneously. In that moment, a long, piercing howl echoed from the well's depths, chilling Ha to her bones. The ground trembled, and from the black pit, a smoky shadow shot into the sky, then disappeared. Ha screamed and collapsed. When she opened her eyes, everything was silent, as though nothing had happened. Morning had come. The villagers were farming and tending chickens as if it were a normal day. The child was gone. Ha asked around, but no one responded. They claimed no such girl ever existed. No ritual had taken place. The well was just a dry depression in the ground. Ha began to doubt her own mind. But when she opened her notebook, the drawings she had made the night before were still there. The fire, the knife, the child, and the shadow that had risen. She decided to stay longer and investigate further. Each night, she secretly recorded audio and sketched her dreams. The images began to repeat, a face without nose or mouth, only deep, bottomless black eyes. She dreamt of falling into the well, endlessly descending, surrounded by bloody hands clutching her hair. In her dreams, a voice whispered, Stay, you belong here. Ha's days blurred together. She no longer knew what time it was or how long she had stayed. Her phone lost signal the moment she entered the village, and the battery had long died. Her notebook, once filled with field notes and academic observations, was now filled with frantic sketches and words she didn't remember writing. Symbols, spirals, disjointed letters written in a mix of languages. She would find her hands stained with ink and charcoal each morning. Sometimes there were drawings she couldn't recall making. A shadow crouched on the roof beams above her, a woman crawling out of the well, or her own face melting into a void. She started hearing the well even in daylight. It called to her, a low hum beneath her consciousness. One afternoon, unable to resist, she approached it. The villagers were nowhere in sight, as if the entire village had dissolved into mist. Ha knelt by the well's mouth. The wind was still, the forest silent. She leaned in. The stone edge was warm, pulsing, almost like flesh. She whispered, "Who are you?" 1,000 whispers answered. She stumbled back, heart pounding, the air suddenly cold around her. A soft laughter echoed behind her, but when she turned, there was nothing. Only the trees beyond, watching. That night, Ha locked the door, but it did not matter. The dreams returned. Only this time, they followed her into the waking world. She would see flashes of the child with the bleeding forehead walking outside her window, dragging her fingers along the wood. The white-haired woman standing in the corner of her room, face expressionless, eyes clouded over like boiled eggs. Once, she woke up standing at the edge of the well, barefoot, her palms cut open and blood dripping onto the stones. Mr. Lamb found her that morning and said nothing. He merely gave her a small satchel of herbs and a jar of what looked like black sap, told her to smear it on her eyes every night before sleep. She obeyed, but it made the dreams more vivid. Now she could see the other side. A place beneath the earth, filled with writhing bodies and hollow-eyed spirits, all kneeling in a circle, chanting her name. She tried to leave. She packed her things, retraced her steps into the forest. But the path curved in impossible ways. Trees she marked with charcoal disappeared, and no matter how long she walked, she always ended up at the village's entrance by nightfall. The villagers no longer pretended not to see her. They watched her openly now, their eyes darker, wider, teeth just a little too sharp. No one spoke. Not anymore. On the 13th night, she found a child's hand nailed to her door. No one claimed it. That night, the white-haired woman came into her room without opening the door. She glided through the wall, fingers dripping with black ichor. Ha screamed and covered herself with the thin blanket, but it clung to her like wet skin. She fainted. When she woke, her mouth was filled with soil. The next morning, she found words carved into the walls of her room, deep gouges in the wood. You are one of us now." Her reflection in the water basin stared back at her with unfamiliar eyes. She blinked, and the reflection did not. She smashed the basin. That evening, Mr. Lamb knocked on her door for the first time since the day she arrived. He told her, without emotion, that the final ritual was approaching. "You were chosen the moment you saw the well," he said. "We do not choose outsiders unless they hear it. It called you." She refused. She screamed, begged, cried, even threatened him with a piece of broken wood. He did not react. He simply nodded and said, "It is already inside you. There is no going back." That night, they came. The entire village gathered. Ha was dragged to the well. Her wrists were tied with hair, black, tangled human hair that smelled of rot. She kicked, bit, screamed, but the forest drowned her voice. They painted her face with ash. Mr. Lamb held a bone knife and made a single cut along her cheek, letting the blood drip into the well. Then they chanted. It was not a chant of words, but of sounds that defied comprehension. Bone against bone, teeth grinding on rock, lungs shrieking air. The well responded. From its bottom, darkness rose, thicker than fog, colder than ice. It wrapped around her ankles. Her body convulsed. Her eyes rolled back. And then she saw it. Not with her eyes, but with something deeper. The being, the true thing beneath the well. It was not a ghost, not a god, not a demon. It was memory. It was grief. It was hunger and silence and the scream of the first thing that ever died. It entered her, and she let it. When Ha woke, she was lying in her room. The candle had burned down to a puddle of wax. The carvings on the wall were gone. The villagers were gone. For the first time in weeks, everything was still. silent. The kind of silence that feels like a breath being held underwater. She stood up slowly, her legs trembling as if she hadn't walked in days. Her throat burned with thirst, but the water in the jug smelled of metal and rot. She went to the mirror. This time, the reflection matched her movements, but it wasn't right. Her eyes were slightly darker, as if ink had seeped into her irises. Her skin had a faint shimmer, like old paper soaked in oil. And when she smiled, just to test, her reflection's grin lingered a second too long. There was no sign of the villagers. She walked out into the daylight, and the village was abandoned. Doors creaked in the breeze, pots boiled with no fire beneath them, laundry swayed on lines as if someone had just left. But there were no footsteps, no sounds. The jungle beyond the trees had fallen quiet, too quiet, as though all birds and insects had flown or died. Ha wandered aimlessly, numb. She stood by the well and looked down. This time, she saw nothing. No shadow, no movement, just a reflection of her own face, distorted, elongated, smiling back at her from below with rows and rows of teeth. She fled. She ran from the well, from the village, from the forest, until her lungs burned. Somehow, the path had returned. It was there now, as if it had always been there. Trees opened like a corridor, the dirt trail stretching ahead, familiar and welcoming. She kept running until her feet bled. The forest grew thinner, the light brighter, and then she emerged onto the main road. A passing truck nearly hit her. The driver slammed on the brakes, jumped out shouting, but his voice was distant, echoey, like she was underwater. He asked if she needed help. She nodded. He drove her to the nearest town. She didn't speak. She stared out the window as trees passed like ghosts. At the hospital, the doctors asked where she had been. She didn't answer. They cleaned her up, bandaged her feet, fed her soup she couldn't taste. Her family came. Her mother cried. Her father held her like she was 6 years old again. They thought she had gone missing, presumed dead. But Ha didn't cry. Not once. She returned to the city, to her apartment. Her professors welcomed her back, astonished she had returned at all. She was thinner, quieter, and always cold. She wore gloves, even in warm weather. Her classmates whispered that she'd lost her mind in the jungle. She didn't care. At night, she heard the well in her dreams. It whispered still. She thought it would fade with time. She thought being back among people would drown it out. But it only grew louder. She began to draw again. The same symbols, the same faceless people, the spiral mouths and the bleeding eyes. Her walls were covered. She stopped sleeping altogether. When she closed her eyes, she would find herself back in the village, standing before the well, listening to the chant that now beat in rhythm with her pulse. She tried to write about what had happened, tried to document it as a case study, cultural manifestations of grief and collective ritual in isolated communities. But the words came out wrong. Her fingers wouldn't type the truth. The moment she tried, the lights in her apartment flickered, the air grew thick, and the pages turned to ash. One night, she found the bone knife in her bed, wrapped in red cloth, exactly as it had been that night. But she had never brought anything back. Had she? She threw it into the river the next day. That night, she woke up with dried blood on her hands. She called Mr. Lamb's name in her sleep. Her friends began to avoid her. Animals growled at her on the street. Strangers looked at her as if they recognized her from something they couldn't explain. Her reflection began to lag again, and sometimes it mouthed words she hadn't spoken. Sometimes it didn't move at all. Then the dreams changed. She was no longer being dragged. She was leading, standing at the edge of the well, arms open. People knelt before her. She chanted the words. She held the knife, and she smiled. Ha began to understand. The ritual was not to keep the thing inside the well. It was to feed it. It was never trapped. It was choosing those who could carry it beyond the forest, those it could wear like skin. It had worn others before. It was wearing her now. She returned to the university library. In the restricted archives, she found more references, old fragmented scrolls from other cultures, other languages, all describing the same thing. A pit that opened between worlds, a voice that sang in the blood, a woman who always returned to spread the worship. Each account ended the same way: fire, silence, and the disappearance of everyone involved. She began to write again. Not the research paper, not the report, but a list. Names, addresses. People she had met since returning. People who had spoken to her, touched her, smiled at her. She underlined the ones who had looked into her eyes for too long. They had heard it too. They just didn't know it yet. Ha no longer feared sleep. She welcomed it. Sleep was where the veil thinned and truth seeped through like water under a locked door. Awake, she was bound by rules, language, reality, time. But asleep, she could step between shadows, float through doorways, whisper to things that had no name. She saw the others there too, those chosen like her, marked across centuries, continents, cultures. A woman wrapped in white silk, holding a head in her lap. A boy with eyes like cracked glass, humming a lullaby that made her bleed from the ears. A man walking backward into the sea, his arms a nest of snakes. They called her sister. They bowed when she passed. She no longer remembered the sound of her mother's voice. One morning, Ha woke to find her fingernails gone. In their place were smooth black plates, hard as stone, curved like talons. She didn't scream. She clipped them off, wrapped them in linen, and buried them under her bed. That night, she dreamt of a girl in the village doing the same thing, carving out her teeth with a fishbone, burying them beneath the stilt house. A week later, the girl visited her, not in a dream. She appeared in Ha's apartment, dripping wet, mud-streaked, barefoot. Her eyes were sewn shut with twine, her lips caked in soil. She reached out and held Ha's face. Then she smiled, not with her mouth, but with something behind her stitched eyes. Her touch burned. In the morning, Ha found a new scar across her cheek, a familiar cut. The bone knife was back, lying on her pillow. By then, the whispers in the city had begun. People reported nightmares. Whole buildings heard the same voice chanting through vents at night. A stray dog was found curled into a perfect circle, at all its teeth grown inward. At the university, 3 students vanished during a field trip to the hills. Their cameras were recovered, but the footage was static, except for one frame. A woman standing in front of a black well, smiling. Ha stopped going outside. She didn't need to. People came to her now. Strangers knocked on her door, some shaking, some calm. One man brought her his tongue in a jar. Another offered his unborn child. A girl with pale eyes climbed 5 floors barefoot and sat cross-legged in her hallway, humming the chant for 3 days until her skin peeled off in the heat. Each one had heard the well. Each one had seen her, in their dreams, in their mirrors, in the flicker of dying lights. She gave them names. She wrote the names in her notebook, which no longer held paper, but thin gray skin. The ink bled like blood. The notebook pulsed when she touched it, like a living thing eager to feed. Her hair grew longer, darker, even in the absence of light. Shadows clung to her like silk. Sometimes they whispered secrets. Sometimes they screamed. By the time the red moon rose, a blood harvest moon not seen in 50 years, she had built an altar in her apartment. It was made of mirrors, bones, and the teeth she had collected from dreamers. In the center, the bone knife hovered, weightless. On the walls, the symbol of the well had begun to etch itself over and over in ash. The building groaned beneath her. The neighbors moved out. Those who stayed did not speak. Their eyes followed her with reverence and dread. One night, she heard chanting from the floor above her, the same rhythm from the village, growing louder with each passing hour. The well was no longer in Tanfeng. It was under her now. It had moved, or perhaps it had always been with her. She began to write letters. Not to people she knew, to others like her. She wrote in languages she didn't study, symbols that turned hot under her fingers. She mailed them to addresses she saw in dreams. Some were old churches, some abandoned ships, some simply holes in the ground. She received replies, bone trinkets, shreds of ancient maps, bottles filled with ash and whispers. One envelope contained a single fingernail, still wet, folded in a page from a burnt Bible. She kept them all in a box that sang when no one listened. On the 7th night after the red moon, she was ready. She descended to the basement of her apartment. No one stopped her. The doors opened on their own. The air thinned. The lights flickered. Pipes dripped something too dark and thick to be water. She walked barefoot, the floor warm beneath her. At the center of the basement, beneath layers of concrete and forgotten foundation, was the well. It was real. It pulsed. It breathed. She stepped to the edge and looked in. There was no bottom. There never had been. It looked back at her, a vast pupil in the center of the world. She raised the bone knife. Her body shook. Her mouth opened, and a voice not hers spoke a name. Not a word, not a sound, but a truth so old and deep it cracked the walls. Then she smiled and stepped in. She did not fall. She sank. She sank through the air as if it were water, slow, silent, heavy. Around her, the walls of the well stretched wider than seemed possible. Roots coiled like veins, faces pressed against the soil, mouths moving without sound, eyes blinking in rhythms she recognized but couldn't name. They weren't alive. They weren't dead. They were waiting, welcoming. Below her, the darkness thickened. Not the absence of light, but the presence of something older than light. Something that remembered the first breath of dust, the first wound carved into the earth, the first lie whispered between humans. It wasn't evil, it simply was. Ha, drifted into it. She expected pain, she expected fear, but what she felt was belonging. The shadows closed around her, not to crush her, but to embrace her. Her body did not dissolve, it changed. Her bones remembered something deeper than anatomy. They bent in ancient curves, her skin hardened into inscriptions, her spine hummed with buried words. She saw time stretch out like threads. Thousands of people, thousands of wells, scattered across the world like seeds, and all of them connected. She saw cities fall in silence, swallowed by their own forgotten shrines. She saw children singing lullabies to wells that fed on their dreams. She saw kings kneeling before hollow trees. She saw herself over and over through time, through faces, not reincarnated but repeated, an echo with flesh. She was not the first. She would not be the last. Then she opened her eyes. She stood in the basement again, but the well was gone. There was only a black stain on the floor, a wet, pulsing circle that steamed against the air. Her knife floated beside her, still stained with blood. The walls of the building were breathing. Outside, the sky was gray. She walked into the streets. The people didn't look at her anymore, not with fear, not with reverence. They looked past her, eyes glazed, mouths murmuring her name without knowing why. Birds flew in spirals overhead. Dogs gathered in the alleyways, lying in concentric rings, howling in harmony. The city was becoming a village. Skyscrapers felt smaller. Sidewalks cracked in spiral shapes. Rivers ran backward. The wind carried voices that didn't come from human lungs. Her name was being said in languages that predated memory. She walked past a playground. Children stopped swinging. They stared at her in silence. One girl with missing eyes reached out and placed a pebble in Ha's hand, round, black, carved with the same spiral. Then she turned and vanished. No one noticed. No one screamed. At home, Ha placed the pebble on her altar. It fit perfectly in a hollow space that hadn't existed the day before. She knew what came next. The infection of places was already beginning, not a disease of the body, but of thought, of space, of memory. Streets would twist subtly. Houses would forget their residents. Mirrors would stop reflecting. The sea would taste of ash. Some would resist. Some would submit. And some, the ones like her, would lead. They would not need to fight, only to whisper and wait. She began writing again, not on paper, but on walls, skin, glass. She scratched her story into the inside of her closet under her sink, in the fog on windows. She painted with rust, with salt, with sleep, her apartment filled with symbols. Her dreams bled into the real. She could hear the well in other cities now, calling others, awakening. A man in Cairo stood at the edge of his rooftop and chanted her name. A girl in Siberia burned her village school and walked barefoot into the taiga. A child in Brazil tore open a termite mound and whispered into it for 7 nights until it answered. Ha saw them all, not in dreams, but in her blood. She tasted every moment they did. On the 10th day, her eyes went black. Not blind, deeper. They absorbed the world, not reflected it. When she walked through crowds, people wept without knowing why. She didn't speak anymore. She didn't need to. Her breath carried meaning. Her silence cracked windows. And then, one morning, she smiled. The smile of someone who remembered the beginning of endings. She walked to the river. The city followed her, not with feet, not with faces, but with its pulse. Traffic stopped. Windows dimmed. All clocks turned to midnight. The river parted for her. Beneath the surface, the outline of a well shone with black light. She stepped into it. Again. The second descent was different. It no longer felt like falling or floating. It felt like returning, like a drop of rain rejoining the sea, like a breath being drawn back into lungs after drowning. The world above faded, not just from view, but from memory. Cities, names, languages, all unraveled like threads in her mind. She was no longer Ha. She had never been Ha. That had only been a mask stitched onto the shape she had worn while she waited to remember. Now she remembered. She was the one who listened when the first well opened in the mouth of a cave where light never touched. She was the first to speak its name. She had taught others how to kneel, how to offer, how to chant. She had scattered seeds of darkness in stories, in lullabies, in symbols scratched behind walls and dreams. Each time she was born, it was not as a child, but as a vessel. Each life was only a page. This was the book, and now she was writing the final chapter. The space around her pulsed, and she saw the others converging. All the chosen, all the vessels, walking through fires, emerging from oceans, tearing themselves free from graves. Their voices rose in a harmony not meant for ears, a resonance of hunger, of worship, of becoming. They came to her, kneeling not as servants, but as parts of a whole. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her presence was the word, and the word was the door. She opened her arms, and the world began to split. Not with explosions, not with war, but with forgetting. Children woke up and didn't remember their parents. Maps changed shape. Satellites turned their cameras to the earth and saw spirals etched in continents. The moon cracked like an egg, but no one screamed, because those who screamed were already gone. Those who remained followed. Ha! Or what she had become stood at the center of it all. Her body no longer cast a shadow. Her hair writhed like ink in water. Her eyes were voids, and inside them spun entire cities made of bone and glass. She walked, and earth opened beneath her. Wells rose from fields, from basements, from the mouths of people who had nothing left to say. She passed through temples. Their gods bowed. She passed through war zones. The bullets stopped in the air. She passed through libraries. The books turned to ash and rebuilt themselves with new stories. Hers. One day she came to a mountain, ancient and untouched. The villagers at its base tried to stop her. They drew salt circles, rang bells, whispered prayers that had once bound things like her in the time before names. But she walked through them. Their salt turned to dust. Their bells bent inward. Their prayers unraveled mid-breath. At the mountain's peak was a well, older than the world. It pulsed when she neared. It glowed. This was not a well to feed. This was a well to awaken. She knelt. All around the world, the others knelt too. And together they sang. It was not a chant. It was not music. It was the language of unmaking, the syllables of silence, the punctuation of rot. Oceans stilled, the sun dimmed, stars blinked, confused. And then the mountain opened. It cracked not with force, but with memory. Out from its heart crawled the original form. Not a god, not a demon, but a root of everything. It had no shape and infinite shapes. It had no face and every face. It was not good. It was not evil. It simply was the thing before thought. The reason mirrors break when you stare too long. The hunger behind hunger. The well behind all wells. Ha bowed. The thing looked into her and saw itself and smiled. When it smiled, the world bent. Not in shape, but in truth. The idea of straight lines disappeared. Time forgot how to move forward. Mountains folded into the sky like paper. The oceans peeled back, revealing cities made of teeth, long buried beneath the waves. Across the world, people stopped mid-step, mid-sentence, mid-thought, frozen not in fear, but in awe. They were not witnessing the end. They were witnessing the remembering. The thing rose from the mountain, not upward, but outward. Its presence unfurled like roots beneath the surface of all things. Trees turned black and began to hum. Animals spoke in voices that echoed from empty wells. Storms danced in spirals, chasing only silence. Ha stood at the center, and the earth pulsed with her breath. She had no more need for body, but she wore it as a kindness. A face to comfort those who still clung to form. Her eyes were galaxies collapsing. Her footsteps left symbols etched in ash. When she raised her hands, cracks spread across the sky. People began to gather. They came from every corner of the earth. Some walked until their feet bled. Some flew. Some crawled through forgotten tunnels beneath cathedrals and prison basements. All of them had heard the same whisper. All of them had dreamed of the same spiral. All of them carried the mark, in their minds, their skin, their blood. The world governments tried to respond. Satellites lost orbit. Communications went silent. Airplanes stopped in midair and drifted slowly down like falling leaves. Tanks melted into the ground. The people inside did not scream. They knelt. They offered their breath. A great spiral formed around the mountain, miles wide, etched into the soil by millions of kneeling forms. They sang not with words, but with the resonance of knowing. Their bones vibrated with purpose. The air thickened until birds could no longer fly. Nothing moved unless it was allowed, and all waited. The thing beneath the mountain, now fully awake, spoke, but not in sound. It spoke in color, in temperature, in memory. Every living mind on Earth saw the same thing: a well in a forest, a girl standing beside it, a knife, a choice, and then silence. Many died in that instant. Some because their minds could not contain what they saw. Some because they finally understood. Some simply walked into the sea, smiling. But others remained, the ones who had always belonged, the ones born to remember. Ha walked among them. She no longer needed names, but those who saw her called her the returning. Some called her the mouth below. Some simply called her sister. She whispered into the soil, and flowers grew upside down, feeding on shadow. She placed her fingers to the air, and birds hatched from silence. She looked into rivers, and reflections climbed out to join her. And still, the spiral grew. The world was changing. Not being destroyed, being rewritten. The new rules were simpler. Do not name the things you dream. When the water whispers, listen. If you find a well, feed it. If you see her smile, follow. And people obeyed. New cities were built around the spiral, made of stone and ash and bone. They did not need light. They did not need walls. They breathed with the earth. The children born there did not cry. They hummed. They knew her face before they opened their eyes. In the last remaining untouched forest, a man tried to pray to his old god. He carved crosses into trees, buried salt, burned candles, but nothing responded. And then he saw her. Ha stepped through the trees like smoke. He asked, trembling, "Are you the devil?" She did not answer. She placed her hand on his chest. He collapsed into ash, and from his remains grew a small flower that never died. And the forest bent to let her pass. The spiral became law. There were no more borders, no more governments, no more cities as they once were. Language fractured and fell away, replaced by shared visions and vibrations of thought that pulsed beneath the skin like veins of smoke. People no longer needed to speak. They felt. They knew. And what they knew was her. Or the shape that once carried that name, wandered through the world as a quiet storm. Her arrival was not announced. It was felt. Rain turned warm, shadows grew longer, dreams bled into waking hours. She moved through the ruins of skyscrapers and found children teaching each other the chant she had never spoken aloud. They sang it perfectly. She touched a glass window and showed those watching what lay beyond it. A place of endless spirals, shifting forms, and a light so dark it erased memory. They wept, not from fear but from recognition. The thing from the mountain had returned to the earth. It no longer needed form. It was everywhere. In the cracks of walls, in the patterns of leaves, in the silence between heartbeats. It watched through mirrors. It waited in reflections. The wells had multiplied. Cities rose around them. Pilgrims came from across the altered lands to kneel and offer their most valuable possession, memory. For in this new world, memory had become the coin of worship. People gathered in circles and emptied their thoughts into the ground. Names disappeared. Faces blurred. What was left was silence and purpose. The chosen ones became vessels. They gave up their pasts in return for a future carved from bone and soil, and Ha stood in the center of them all. She no longer ate. She no longer slept. Her eyes never blinked. Where she passed, time thickened. Trees bent toward her like worshippers. The air held its breath. Her skin bore no mark of age or harm, only spirals that moved slowly, as if breathing. One evening, she entered a town built around a great pit, a well that had opened on its own. The people there wore robes of dust and teeth. They walked on their hands. They had no faces, only mouths on their chests, which sang constantly in different tones, weaving together a harmony that ached to hear. They knew she was coming. They had built her a throne. It was made of silence, a platform surrounded by nothing. When she stepped onto it, the ground fell away, and she hovered above the earth like the moon. The mouths of the people sang louder. Some of them cracked from the force of it. Some bled. None stopped. She sat, and the dreaming began. Everyone on earth fell asleep in the same instant, and all of them dreamed the same dream. They saw the first well, the true well. Not dug by hands or tools, but born from thought, a wound in the world. They saw the first offering, a nameless creature that stepped willingly into the dark. They saw the smile of the thing that accepted it, and they saw Ha walking out of that darkness holding the knife. When they awoke, they understood. They were not living in her world. They were remembering it. The world before had been an illusion, a fever dream of order and logic. This was the correction, the return, the alignment of bone with breath, of silence with form. The story had always been about the well, the spiral, the girl. Everything else had just been forgetting. And now, no one forgot. The world settled into its spiral. There were no more sunrises, only shifts of light. Not day or night, but the breathing rhythm of the earth. The oceans no longer followed the moon. They followed her. The tides rose when she opened her eyes and sank when she closed them. Stars dimmed to let her see better. Fire no longer burned unless she allowed it. She became the axis upon which the new world turned. The old names, country, science, soul, fell apart like moth wings in the rain. They were too brittle for what had awakened. People no longer taught history. They taught memory, not what was, but what had always waited beneath. Each generation forgot faster, until even forgetting itself was forgotten. Children were born with spirals on their palms. They never cried. They never learned to speak. They simply stared at the wells and hummed. In the last church on earth, a priest stood before an altar cracked down the center. The stained glass showed her face now. He held a Bible with blank pages. He tried to remember his God's name, but it turned to ash in his throat. And when he wept, it was not sorrow, it was joy. Because now he finally knew. His God had been a lie of light. Hers was the truth of shadow. He walked barefoot to the nearest well and stepped in. He never touched the bottom. The cities became bone and black stone. The streets spiraled inward toward a single well, always at the center, always humming. Markets sold jars of silence, and lanterns lit only with memory. Those who still dreamed saw the spiral not as a symbol, but as a path. They walked it in their sleep and never returned. And at the center of all of it, Ha! She stood beneath a sky that no longer contained stars, only the drifting eyes of what watched from the other side. Her body glowed faintly now, not with heat, but with something deeper, more solemn. A truth that pressed against skin and bent time. The others gathered around her, the ancient vessels, the chosen from across forgotten empires. They no longer had names either, only sounds. They knelt in a circle of mirrors, and their reflections moved on their own. The well behind them throbbed like a heartbeat, echoing out into the cracks of the world. Ha raised the knife. It was not bone anymore. It had become language. The blade shimmered with every word ever spoken, and every word yet to come. It could cut not just flesh, but reality. She held it over her own chest, not to end herself, but to open something older inside her. A mouth beneath the ribs, a voice that had waited for centuries. She pressed the blade down. There was no blood. There was a sound like all silence at once, a cathedral collapsing underwater, a scream held so long it had turned into music. And then, from her open chest, they emerged. The true choir, mouthless, boneless, timeless, the shape behind all shapes. They poured out of her like fog, spiraling upward into the sky, and the sky accepted them. The earth shook not in fear, but in celebration. All the wells roared together. All people knelt without command. All things understood. This was not the end. This was the awakening. The spiral had bloomed. From her open chest, the spiral bloomed, not outward but inward, curling through dimensions of thought, hunger, and form. The choir of the formless rose through her like smoke through hollow bone, spreading across the sky in slow, soundless waves. Above them, the stars extinguished themselves in reverence. The heavens fell silent, listening. The final song began. It was not sung by mouths, but by everything. The trees, the stones, the air, the wells. The hum passed through oceans like bone-conducted vibration. Entire mountain ranges trembled in time with it. Volcanoes opened but did not erupt. Instead, they exhaled spirals of ash, painting the skies with the symbol of remembering. Children everywhere stopped breathing, not from death, but from the need to inhale the chant instead of air. Ha stood at the center, her body hollow, her purpose complete. And then she stepped backward into the well. The earth did not collapse. It inhaled. The well widened, deepened, pulsed with endless hunger, and the spiral across the world turned slowly. Oceans followed it. Clouds bent to its rhythm. All things moved with it, not out of fear, not out of force, but out of recognition. The planet realigned, became its truest shape, a turning, endless prayer carved in stone and blood. Above, the shape of the sky changed. No longer flat or dome-like, it curved downward, as if the stars had turned into eyes watching from above the spiral. Comets wrote symbols across the firmament. Moons bled dust. The sun pulsed a final time and dimmed, not out of death, but submission. No longer a source of life. Now, only witness. Ha did not return. She had never needed to. Her presence was now everywhere. In the way water curled as it drained, in the way dreams ended before climax, in the quiet between a mother's last breath and a child's first cry. She became the space between what was and what will be. Generations passed. Children born into the spiral did not walk. They floated. Their thoughts formed architecture. Their laughter cracked mirrors. They did not bury their dead, for no one died. Only changed. Only re-entered the spiral from a different point. They held their ancestors in jars of dust and songs. They remembered everything, even things they had never lived. Wells became temples. Temples became cities. Cities became stories. And one day, long after the old world was forgotten completely, a girl was born in a village where the forest met the mist. She walked alone. She listened to silence. And one morning, she found a well. It was old and covered in moss, but humming. She leaned over the edge.